Daniel Hayes, the beloved pastor of Cedarville, seemed like a man of faith, but behind closed doors, his dark secret was about to shatter an entire community. Pastor Daniel Hayes had always been considered the pride of Cedarville. His tall frame, neatly pressed suits, and warm, confident smile made him appear approachable, trustworthy, and undeniably charismatic. Every Sunday, the church would fill to capacity, not only with longtime parishioners but with curious newcomers drawn by the promise of hope, guidance, and comfort. Families often said their lives had been transformed by his sermons, which were filled with moral lessons, stories of overcoming hardship, and reminders of faith's power. Parents encouraged their children to participate in youth programs he ran, believing they were safe in the care of someone so respected. On the surface, Daniel Hayes seemed like the embodiment of everything a pastor should be: selfless, devoted, and deeply spiritual. Yet beneath the public persona, there was a carefully concealed darkness. Few noticed the subtle signs at first: the way he lingered too long with certain young adults during private counseling sessions, the insistence on one-on-one meetings with vulnerable congregants, and the occasional slightly inappropriate remarks he made under the guise of pastoral guidance. Whispers did circulate among a few cautious members, but their voices were muffled by the overwhelming admiration the community held for him. Doubt and fear kept people silent, and the man who preached about truth and righteousness used that silence to his advantage. Behind closed doors, Hayes manipulated those who trusted him most, exploiting their fears, insecurities, and personal struggles. He had an uncanny ability to read people, to sense weakness or desperation, and to twist it into compliance. Letters, gifts, and private conversations were all tools in his arsenal, gradually ensnaring his victims in a web they could not easily escape. His life was meticulously organized to maintain appearances, presenting a perfect image to outsiders while hiding a predatory nature that preyed on the very community that loved him. Even those who experienced unsettling incidents found themselves questioning their own judgment, blaming their perception rather than confronting the horrifying truth. Daniel Hayes' double life persisted because no one wanted to believe that someone so revered, someone who carried the outward symbols of morality and spirituality, could be capable of deception. It was this combination of charm, influence, and hidden menace that allowed him to operate undetected for years, leaving a trail of unseen victims whose trust had been shattered by the very man they had been taught to follow. The first serious cracks in Daniel Hayes' flawless image appeared quietly, almost imperceptibly. A former member of the congregation, someone who had once admired him deeply, decided to speak out, filing a complaint with local authorities. At first, it seemed isolated, almost trivial. Many dismissed it as an overreaction or personal vendetta. But as the investigation unfolded, a pattern began to emerge. Other victims who had remained silent for years started coming forward. Their accounts were eerily similar: invitations for private meetings under the guise of spiritual guidance, subtle manipulations that eroded boundaries, and an underlying pressure to keep everything confidential. Each story revealed a side of Hayes that no sermon or charity effort could hide: the careful, predatory control he wielded over those who trusted him most. Investigators began piecing together the puzzle, examining emails, text messages, and digital correspondence that Hayes thought were secure. Hidden folders, encrypted files, and deleted conversations revealed a disturbing level of premeditation. He was not merely opportunistic. He had calculated his moves, choosing victims he thought would not speak out, exploiting the very faith and trust he had cultivated for decades. The more authorities uncovered, the clearer it became that Hayes had used his position as a pastor as both shield and weapon. Parents, friends, and neighbors who had once rallied around him struggled to reconcile the man they had trusted with the evidence being revealed. The church itself became a place of tension and suspicion, as members questioned how they could have been deceived for so long. Even those who had suspected something in the past found it difficult to fully grasp the extent of his wrongdoing. Community leaders faced scrutiny for turning a blind eye, while law enforcement worked tirelessly to ensure the victims' voices were heard. Social media amplified the story, and what had once been whispered rumors now became public knowledge. Hayes' charm, which had allowed him to manipulate and control, now failed him entirely. The layers of secrecy he had built around his life were unraveling, exposing a man who had lived a lie so convincingly that few could have imagined it possible. By the time the authorities had gathered enough evidence to proceed, it was undeniable that Daniel Hayes was not the shepherd the town believed he was. The foundation of his influence had begun to crumble, revealing a dark truth that left the community shaken, betrayed, and determined to see justice served. When Daniel Hayes finally faced the consequences of his actions, the town of Cedarville watched with a mix of disbelief and grim satisfaction. The arrest had been swift once law enforcement had gathered enough evidence, but the reality of what had transpired was difficult for the community to process. Families who had once trusted him implicitly felt their faith and judgment shaken to the core. The courtroom became a stage for the shocking revelations that would soon grip the entire region. Testimonies from victims were harrowing, each account painting a chilling picture of manipulation, deceit, and abuse. They described private meetings disguised as counseling sessions, the subtle coercion that kept them silent, and the emotional and psychological toll Hayes' actions had taken on their lives. As witnesses recounted their experiences, it became clear that Hayes' crimes were not spontaneous lapses in judgment but a carefully orchestrated pattern of predatory behavior. The prosecution presented digital evidence, text messages, emails, and photos that corroborated the victims' statements. Each piece of evidence exposed the methodical nature of his crimes, demonstrating that Hayes had exploited the trust placed in him by the very community he had vowed to serve. Despite his confident demeanor and attempts to appear repentant, the defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. The courtroom, packed with curious townspeople, media personnel, and families seeking closure, became a tense arena where the truth could no longer be denied. As the trial unfolded, the contrast between the public figure and the hidden predator could not have been starker. News outlets reported every detail, and the story spread beyond Cedarville, turning Hayes into a cautionary tale for communities everywhere. When the jury delivered a guilty verdict on multiple counts of sexual misconduct and exploitation, a wave of relief washed over the town, tempered by the lingering sense of betrayal. The sentence was substantial, reflecting the severity of his actions and the lasting impact on his victims. While Hayes was taken away to begin his prison term, Cedarville was left to grapple with the emotional aftermath. The church he had led struggled to regain its footing, attempting to rebuild trust among its members. Families worked to heal from the trauma, forever marked by the duplicity of a man they had once admired. Hayes' fall from grace served as a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that even those who seem most virtuous may harbor darkness behind their carefully maintained masks. The town had faced the ugly truth, and while justice had been served, the scars of his deception remained. Just as Cedarville began to heal from the shock of Daniel Hayes' crimes, the community was blindsided by a new wave of fear. Hayes, released early due to procedural errors in his original trial, quietly returned to the area under a carefully constructed alias. At first, no one noticed him. He blended into the background, avoiding public attention, keeping his presence subtle. But local authorities soon began receiving tips from residents who sensed something was off. Reports of unusual interactions, suspicious behavior around vulnerable community members, and unexplained phone calls hinted that Hayes had never truly changed. Investigators realized that the predator who had once devastated the town was now moving freely among those he had harmed before. Hayes' intelligence and meticulous planning allowed him to remain under the radar, but small inconsistencies began to draw scrutiny. Digital footprints, surveillance footage, and witness accounts revealed that he was attempting to rebuild connections, reconnecting with people from his past, and seeking opportunities to exert influence again. Each new detail confirmed investigators' worst fears. Hayes had not reformed. The man who had manipulated families and exploited trust was quietly plotting, hiding in plain sight. The community, already scarred by his previous crimes, was thrust back into anxiety and suspicion. Parents grew wary, children were kept closer, and church activities became tense and cautious. Those who had once admired him now watched for signs of deception, fearful that a predator might still be lurking in their midst. The authorities intensified their efforts, coordinating with local and state agencies to track his movements, digital activity, and contacts. They soon discovered that Hayes had been attempting to approach not only previous victims, but also new potential targets, a terrifying realization that confirmed he posed an ongoing threat. The town, which had once celebrated his downfall, now faced the unnerving truth: a predator can return even after justice seems served. The investigation became urgent, a race against time to prevent further harm. Surveillance, careful monitoring, and tip-offs eventually led to enough evidence to justify another arrest. Hayes' return forced Cedarville to confront the uncomfortable reality that trust, once broken, is difficult to restore, and that some predators are never truly reformed. The town braced for the confrontation that would finally put an end to his manipulations, knowing that vigilance and decisive action were the only defenses against a man who had already shown he could deceive even the most vigilant community members. The arrest of Daniel Hayes shook Cedarville once more, but this time, the community was determined not to let him slip away. Law enforcement, armed with extensive evidence from surveillance, digital forensics, and numerous tip-offs, finally had the proof needed to ensure Hayes would face justice without loopholes. The investigation revealed a disturbing truth. Hayes had not only returned to the town, but had been actively planning to contact previous victims and identify new targets. The careful patience he had once used to manipulate people now worked against him, as authorities meticulously documented every action, message, and movement. When Hayes was taken into custody for the second time, the sense of relief among residents was palpable, though tempered by lingering fear and anger. This arrest was different. It carried the weight of a man who had proven he could not be trusted, and the legal system responded accordingly. Court proceedings moved swiftly, and the case left no room for doubt. Digital evidence, corroborating witness statements, and meticulous records of his attempts to reestablish contact with victims painted a clear picture of a man who had never reformed. Hayes' demeanor in court could not hide the truth any longer. The man who once wore the mask of a devoted pastor now faced the full consequences of his predatory actions. When the verdict was announced, the sentence was significantly longer than his first, designed to prevent any further harm and to protect the community. The impact of his crimes had left deep scars, and the court's decision offered a sense of closure and justice long overdue. Families and victims began the slow process of healing, their courage in coming forward instrumental in ensuring Hayes would no longer have the opportunity to exploit anyone. The church, once a place of reverence and betrayal, worked to rebuild its reputation, instituting stricter oversight and support systems to protect members from similar manipulation in the future. Cedarville itself had changed. The town's collective awareness of hidden dangers grew, along with a cautious understanding that trust must be balanced with vigilance. Hayes' story became more than a local scandal. It became a warning of how predators can hide behind positions of authority, charm, and morality. While justice had been reclaimed, the lessons endured. Appearances can deceive, evil can lurk where it is least expected. And the resilience of a community is tested not just by the actions of one man, but by how it responds, protects, and learns. In the aftermath, Cedarville emerged scarred but wiser, its people forever vigilant and determined that such darkness would never find a foothold again.